Hello and welcome to another episode of the Testing Peers podcast. Today I am joined by one regular, David.
Hello.
One becoming regular, Shey.
Hiya.
And one new face, Steve.
Hi everyone.
Today we're going to be talking about communication. But before we jump into that, we just want to have a little message to our sponsors, and we're delighted that Saffron QA continue to sponsor the podcast. Saffron QA is a specialist in testing recruitment, offering permanent, contract, and a newly developed retained recruitment service. More details can be found in the show notes, or please reach out to Ben directly to find out more. So, before we dive fully into communication, Shey, what have you got for us?
Well, Chris, I was wondering, who from history would you like to sit down and have a beer with, and why?
It's a good one, isn't it?
That's a good one.
That's a very broad topic.
Exactly. Let's see what we can come up with.
And you've prefaced it with from history. That could be like anything, anytime. But I'm trying not to think too far back. Because if you go too far back, like the kind of English they'd be speaking does not relate to me.
Well, you can converse in it. You might as well draw pictures or thing. If it's a caveman.
Just with Cleopatra, and we'll just do hieroglyphics. It'll be fine.
Yeah.
I'll kick us up and probably go. I think, quite enjoy have a beer with Freddie Mercury. I think he'd be a really interesting person to chat to. He could also, go on the old ivories and sing a little song too. But I think he'd be really interesting. And I could discover how much of that movie Bohemian Rhapsody was actually real.
That's really cool. I like that. Steve,
what about you?
Oh, that is a great question to get me introduced. Cheers. My brain was ticking over then as Chris was taking up his turn. And I actually think I'd be a little bit closer to home. Mine would be my dad's dad, my granddad, who unfortunately passed away when I was 2. So I just don't remember a single thing about him. But I hear all these absolutely amazing things off my dad and my mum, and I know working down the mines for 15 hours and 17 hours a day and smoking like a chimney and these sort of things. And I'd love to just be able to have a conversation to really get to know him. And I wonder how similar my life may have been and things that turned out for me. I'd just love an hour with him to have that chat. I think that'd be me.
Very good. For me, I would probably choose someone probably slightly political. So I'd probably choose someone like Nelson Mandela. I think it would be very interesting to find out actually what his life was like, what his struggles were, because I know he's been written about a lot, but I'd like to hear it exactly from him as to exactly what his life was like.
Very, very cool. For me, I'm listening a lot about pirates at the moment. And so I think I'd like to meet Henry Avery or Henry Every, depending on which book you read, and sort of find out what the life of a pirate was like. He was a very larger than life character. Yeah, there's some amazing stories about him, and I'd love to just hang out with him and have a beer.
Cool. Well, thank you for sharing all those ideas. Obviously, having a conversation over beer and also being testing peers, and often we have beers with the peers, but unfortunately we're recording earlier in the day, so we won't be having our beers today. So communication, we're obviously talking on a podcast. It's a newer way of communicating. But obviously in our workplaces, we have to communicate with so many different people. So let's open the conversation. What ways do we use, or the best ways of communicating with our people at work?
Can we not start with the worst ways to communicate with people?
Well, we can start with that if you want. Let's start on the negative.
I like a good rant. I find the ones that are worst, this is right now in this remote world, when people either communicate via commenting on a tool that I don't have access to, but linking me to it, or only talking to me via a calendar invite. And that sort of thing gets quite lost. Google have done a good job in G Suite of now showing you which part has changed in a calendar invite these days, which is brilliant, by the way. But it's still really easy to meet that stuff. I mean, how hard actually is it to message somebody to make sure that they've received your message or done those things? Maybe on top of that, I mean, those things are the worst.
I do agree. I think that meetings without any context are absolutely a nightmare. You sort of turn up at them with these faceless people that you might not have met at all, and are expected to know what's going on in it, especially if you've got back-to-back meetings. Well, you don't know what to plan for, you haven't had to chase, and you just turn up. It's a big nightmare.
So no, sorry, I was just going to say on your point there, I agree completely around about the context of meetings. I think that's one of the biggest challenges just in general about moving to remote working, isn't it? So if you remember when we were all in the office, and it doesn't seem that long ago, but it was that chat in between the meetings that gave you the context to what you're about to go into. And now you're fully remote. Like Chris was saying, you either get linked to something or you get a calendar invite, and then 5 minutes before it's a Slack message. So you don't have that same time to prepare. And I do find that frustrating as well, I must admit.
Yeah, meeting invites without any context in them is so very annoying. I do try and sort of message somebody and go, hey, look, I've looked at your calendar. You've got time this afternoon. Is it cool to have a meeting about blah? That's what you do normally in a workplace, isn't it? You'd go over to the person and go, hey, look, I can see you're busy. I could do with a chat about this. Can I put some time in your calendar? Yeah, sure. No worries. Yeah, it's just courtesy. But also it's effective communication. It means that when you come to the meeting, you kind of are prepared.
It's context as well. I mean, I talk about context all the time on this podcast, but it's really important because these things can be really disruptive to your work. Like you might be already having a crazy home life right now, and maybe you've got people in and out, kids and what have you, but trying to plan how we do our work is difficult even in the office sometimes, and to try and like get into the right flow and still be available and not be a blocker to other people. To have folks just drop in with meetings or not helpful messages at times is quite difficult because I don't like being unavailable. I don't like being a blocker, but to receive messages that don't have context or invitations to meetings that aren't useful, that can be really, really difficult to sort of then get back from the frustration of the thing that has happened. That sort of thing will throw me off possibly worse than an ineffective meeting, just being annoyed about an ineffective meeting or an ineffective email. I've had it before where I've been sent an email and it's had CC'd in a bunch of folks that didn't need to be. And you think, this is definitely one of those ones, which is the reverse of a meeting should be replaced by an email. This is that we can have a conversation and we can sort things out like this. We've made a mountain out of a molehill. And I think sometimes we don't think of the consequences of bad communication and what that does to our productivity or even our morale.
And on that topic as well, it's the exhaustion or the overuse of Zoom invites, isn't it? If there's no clear agenda and there's nothing to discuss, before you know it, you've spent your entire day having meetings about the meeting you're supposed to have when you have the meeting. And it's like, really, does this need to happen? Where are those traditional communication skills where we can just have a conversation up front and set that? Zoom exhaustion is a real thing, and you have to be very careful. And
meetings to plan meetings, what are they about?
Yeah, exactly.
You want to get me ranty, Shey? You invite me to a meeting about a meeting, and then you'll see just how important I think that is. I think it's absolutely abhorrent. If you can't sort the meeting out without having a meeting about the meeting, then you need to rethink what you're doing. Yeah. You kind of need to rethink why you're having that meeting in the first place. The one that is going to be the actual meeting you're talking about, because if you can't figure it out without the help of the people that are actually going to be in the meeting, you probably, no.
I think we're absolutely right. I think that meetings have to have value. Whatever reason that you're talking to someone or communicating with something, it needs to add value. I'm a great believer that I'm not great at communicating in writing. And sometimes, in Teams channel, you write a quick message and it starts going a bit ranty and you're not making it clear as to what the message actually is. So in that respect, I will be far happier in asking if I can have a chat to them about what I'm trying to portray or give the message so that they hear it straight away, rather than having that long written discussion back and forth. And you never seem to get anywhere. And actually the message can be then clouded. A quick call for 5 minutes can set a lot of expectations correctly.
That's a really good point. But on the flip side of things, again, going back to the sort of hybrid remote working, so much context can be lost via Slack. You try to get that context up front, and even the way you think you're coming across over a Slack message can be interpreted very differently at the recipient's end. So then all of a sudden you're having like sort of coffee break Zooms just to say, no, I didn't mean it like that. What I really meant was this. So it is a balancing act, isn't it, as well?
I've had a rule that kind of started with myself about 15 or so years ago. If I found an email thread going back and forwards about 3 times, then it's time to call a meeting. And it's something that I sort of coach people if I'm their leader. It's like, okay, I've seen that go back 3 times. call the meeting. It'll be a 5-minute meeting and it'll be done. And make sure it's only a 5-minute meeting, because that's all it needs to be. It doesn't need to be half an hour.
It's interesting though. I think a lot of what we've talked about here is how like remote and sort of communication that's asynchronous has been quite difficult. And the assumption is we all probably find in person comes a bit easier, but that doesn't mean we don't get those things wrong either. Even though I can put a lot more context and nuance and intonation and stuff in my intimation. Oh, who knows? Let's pretend I knew that was the right word. And my voice flows and is more received because people know that I'm being fun or serious, or I'm placing emphasis in different places that you can't necessarily do so subtly when you're writing. That doesn't yet mean that people aren't going to misinterpret what's going on. It doesn't yet mean that I'm not getting my point across well to people, because the folks that we work with will still have their own biases. They'll still have their own things about them that maybe we don't know. And the context is so much broader. It's really understanding the people that we work with, the people that we're communicating with, understanding where they've come from, why things are the way they are, and to try and really build upon that sort of human relationship thing in order for us to then work better. It's not easy. And I've certainly offended people in the past, even though either I was trying to be lighthearted or I was trying to be friendly or to try and resolve problems in like, I can come in and solve this because I'm great with people. It's not always that easy, is it?
No, I agree. I think that there are a couple of points there that I was going to pick up on. Firstly, and I'm guilty of myself, sometimes I've written bug reports where I've got so much context in my head, I know exactly what's happening, and I've written down what I consider to be the best description of exactly what went on. And then I come back the next day and it's utter rubbish. It doesn't have all the details, because at my time of writing, I was in the moment and I had all the details. I think that the other point I was going to make was that when we communicate, we need to make sure that we are communicating correctly to the audience that we are talking to. If they are incredibly technical, then we are allowed to be a bit more technical in that respect, and we can go into much more detail. But if it's someone who's making a decision based on time or whatever, they might not necessarily need the detail. They just want to know exactly what's happening. And so many times I've been in stand-ups or whatever, where often people go into too much detail, so therefore the stand-up lasts a lot longer than the duration should be, because people don't recognize what the purpose of that particular meeting actually is. And it's just snappy what you are doing and what you're going to do about it. They get too much caught up in the detail.
Yeah, it's really important to think about your audience. There's a fantastic book called Don't Make Me Think by Steve Krug. It's about 20 years old now, but it's fantastic. It really talks about website design and user experience and stuff, and talking about sort of like, don't put so much text in there that people will just like text load, overload, and then go to a different site. But one of the things he talks about is like sending an email to say somebody higher up, a C-suite or something like that. When you're emailing somebody important and you're like, okay, so you start going, I was thinking of this and I did this. You give the entire backstory about what you were thinking, and then with the conclusion of, please could you review this document if you have time and everything. You've written 4 paragraphs. They're not going to read that. They don't care. They don't have time. They're time poor people quite often. So real easy is like, hey, I've got a few thoughts on this document. I'd really appreciate your feedback when you've got a moment. I need it sent out by this time. I hope that's cool. Boom. You said exactly the same thing. It's taking you less time to write it. It's taking them less time to read it, read your email. Therefore, they're probably going to look at your document. And it's that kind of thing. Time poor people, shorten the amount of words you put into your email or your communication with them, and you get better results.
That's a really valid point. And there was 2 points there you spoke about. And I think what always comes to my mind is the word respect. You've got to be respectful of people's time. You've got to be respectful of people. Everyone is slightly different, and everyone acts differently and responds differently to communication techniques. So knowing your audience is very important. When it's a wide audience where you can't just adapt to that individual per se, short and snappy, to the point, relevant is ultra important. And I think what's really sort of resonates there is you guys, I'm sure you guys know about the story about the one-page test strategy that people try to adopt nowadays. previously there was examples where I think someone had written Lorem Ipsum or at the back of a document or a back of a test strategy, and absolutely none of the reviewers saw it because it was on page 4009. And it was just a great example of what you were saying there is, if it's not short and to the point, people have time that's precious, so use it wisely. Absolutely agree.
That leads into a lot of other things, doesn't it? Because that leads into how people communicate regarding how you consume information. So active listening and active reading of information and such. And if you're asked to review something, review that thing. Don't just pass a glance at it. Be honest, be open about what you can and can't do, set those expectations. But also there's the whole thing with active listening when you're actually talking to folks. And then we've had conversations before about people who maybe have the camera off because they're doing other work during meetings, or where you're not able to concentrate to what people are saying because you're thinking too much in your own mind about how you would answer that question or how that relates to your life. And those are difficult things for us to do, because on one hand, when it comes to those things, we're thinking, I can relate to this and I can tell that person I can relate to this, so they will know that I relate to this thing, which means that we'll have a better connection. But that isn't always the way those things work, is it? And I think often it pays to think about how you would feel if someone was that way with you, and how could what I'm projecting be consumed by other people? How would I feel that way around? Because it's disrespectful, isn't it? Like, I don't like it. And I kind of get the feeling that if I were to give a test strategy to someone to review, I'd planted things in that weren't helpful to people and they didn't see that, I'm like, well, what is the point in asking you to do that thing? Why would I bother? What is the point? And I think we really need to be more aware of the optics, how it looks, how it feels, how it's consumed and received by people.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that we need to think about our audience. And also going back to Shey's and Steve's point is about the information that you put in. We're talking about reports and things like that, but also how many people have died by death by PowerPoint, just reams of slides full of words. And actually, we need to tie in again to people's sort of learning styles or how they actually take in information. Some people can't cope with loads and loads of written work. And I know we're very document centric in various industries and creating these test strategies, and Agile's trying to reduce that a little bit, which is helpful. But there is still a time when there will be documents, and sometimes a diagram will help, sometimes a graph will help, sometimes break it up so that it makes it a lot easier and that people with different learning styles can interpret the information more easily.
Yeah, it's so difficult catering for all people. And you mentioned different learning styles and different communication styles. It's really interesting because death by PowerPoint, PowerPoint is a challenge, right? If you're doing a presentation, to have just enough information that people can get what you're talking about, but not so much that they go, oh, I know what you're about to say, and I'll switch off now. I have a friend, his name's John Torrance, and he's a communication coach. And on one of these YouTube videos, I think he challenges people to try and do their presentation or whatever without any slides. Can you communicate effectively without the crutch that is PowerPoint? And think about that. Think about all the talks you've given, and you think, oh, I'm not sure I could. It's such a safety blanket for me. And if you're going to have slides, think about what the message is going across and ensure that it's part of the conversation, not the actual conversation.
That's a point that was close to home, actually. I think it was what Chris was saying before about being in the moment and making sure you are receiving the information when someone's speaking to you. And I'm guilty of that. That's an area that I really need to focus on when people talk to me, because I'm always thinking of the next idea. So say David just spoke, Shey just spoke, Chris has just spoke. I'm thinking of what they've just said when someone else is talking. So I need to try and adapt myself to that moment. And I did a talk at Salford University for the second year students and computer science students around about quality in test, the importance of testing in the software development lifecycle. And the first time I went there as Steve Warburton, and my learning style and communication style is very much some bullet points so I can talk around about a point, not a very scripted sort of approach to something where I'll read each line. If I do that, I sort of fall flat on my face. I get muddled up over the words rather than the content I'm trying to say. And the head of the lecturer said, I've never had someone that's come in, a guest that's come in and done that without a presentation. And it sort of put me on the back foot a little bit because I had to go and reassess how I was doing that presentation. Was that actually the right way that I approached that? So every year that I go in now, I do go in with, to Dave's point, content that's just enough to keep people awake, but I've still got that ability to talk over it. And that's how I tend to approach it. And it seems to come back with a relative success anyway. So yeah, good points.
One thing I would say that we all need to be careful of is sometimes, and again, I'm guilty of this, sometimes when we get very enthusiastic about things, we can ramble on for a very long time, and we need to consider what the message is we're giving. We need to be concise. We need to actually cut down sometimes the information, especially in meetings or on podcasts, that we can actually make a point very quickly and allow time for it to be assessed, rather than trying to cut out the useful information from the long list of words that are being spoken.
This is where things like feedback are useful. We've got people doing slides and having talks and communication. If you've got folks that you can practice with or who are open to give you feedback to those things, you can refine those things. You can learn what the right style, the right method to deliver information is going to be. And also hopefully give that feedback to people about how you best do it, because actually it might be that setting loads of context is actually important in some contexts, but in others not. Like feeding the right information to the right people, I think as testers is quite important for us. We have a lot of stuff to give, but to different people, they're only concerned with different things. So you only have to give as much context to those people as is possible. And to the point about the slides, just coming back to that point, Lisa Crispin tweeted last month about accessibility with slides at conferences. And she mentioned how if there's a hearing impaired audience member, they may well lose the context of what you're talking about if they don't have slides. And so it's something to consider depending on your audience when you're presenting these things on to do with accessibility as well, which was a really interesting point, because I'd kind of thought it's kind of cool to have almost nothing on my slides and just talk, but it's worth considering depending on your audience how those things are.
I really like it when speakers make their slides or their talk available online. So if there was something you missed from an accessibility point of view, perhaps, but also just from a focus point of view, making the notes and slides available is awesome. Thank you to people who do that. That's really good.
Yeah, that sort of took the words out of my mouth completely. Yeah, I absolutely agree. Some of the, I was going to just say around about tooling, and tools are as good as you make them, right? And they're either good or bad depending on how you use them. If you just think about our sort of technical stack where I am, we've got Bitbucket as a form of communication. We've got Jira as a form of communication. We've got Slack as a form of communication. We've still got email as a form of communication. Communication can all of a sudden become distributed and disparate because of which tools that you use. So I think I don't like to use this word, but rules or patterns around about how you communicate and align terminology and expectations. If it is a casual conversation, let's go through Slack. If it's something that needs to be captured for a quality life cycle or something that's being deployed, let's make sure we've got that through automation, Bitbucket or Jira, or wherever it be. So what you were saying there around about having the language and the text available and the documentation available for people who don't just receive it sort of through hearing and visually, that's ultra important to them. And again, tools are obviously the biggest part of that at this moment in time. And I wondered where you guys are. Have tools been a help or a hindrance in your sort of businesses?
I was going to pick up on that point. I think that tools can be very useful, but I think the problem for me, and you highlighted it a little bit, is which tool do you use for the particular method of communication? Sometimes I find as a manager, I get messaged either through Teams or through email or various things. And I then go to the person that the message was about and then have to try and remember where I saw that information. So sometimes it can be a hindrance because I'm trying to fight the tools to find out where that information actually came through to me so that I can give the first-hand message or the second-hand message directly from the message that I got. And that can be incredibly frustrating and time-consuming trying to remember where that particular part was. And also remembering, especially if the messages were left last thing on a Friday, trying to remember where that message was, or again on first thing on Monday morning. Do you flag them as unread so that therefore they're higher priority and so you can see that you've actually done it? So I haven't found the correct method yet as to how best to use it, I would say.
I must say, I like my current company. We use Slack for probably about 90% of our communication. We're very email light, and by design as well. It's a bit easier when you're in a 50-person company than 500 or 1,000-person company. So give you that context there. But yeah, it does make it a lot easier because the chances are the communication you're looking for is in Slack. But I like that conversational aspect. There's the eternal problem of people expecting you to be available all the time. As soon as they send you a message and you haven't sent anything back, they're like, dude, I sent you a message. What the hell? I work really hard on sort of going, look, this is low priority, just putting this out there. Or if they don't get back to me, it's fine. I put my head in their space and go, they're probably really busy. Don't worry about it. They'll come back to me or something. And I've worked really hard over lockdown to sort of not be that person who's expecting an instant answer the whole time.
Well, on the flip side of that, because I agree completely, and getting used to asynchronous communication is different than being sort of in the moment and synchronized. And this is going to probably the wrong terminology, but what is acceptable for asynchronous replies to people then? So say, for example, Chris dropped me a message and we both know that we're working that day. Where's the boundary to where I say, hey, dude, did you get the message? Or do you think one at all?
It's an interesting question, actually, isn't it? Because sometimes you can message people and then at best you might get an emoji thumbs up, and that does happen. But I think it's very often it's implied that we kind of know that this stuff's going, and I'll say those if it's really urgent, then it'll be that way. For me, in my current work, I know that people are working different hours, but I do know when everyone's online because the little green dot. And I guess the expectation is if it's really urgent, you might follow up, you might chase them a bit, but we haven't got an explicit way of doing this. I have worked in places that tried to enforce a strict communication protocol, i.e., if you had an email, you had to reply within half a day. If you had David's looking horrified slightly, but they did try to actually add these things in. Like if you're tagged in something, you should be replying to those things within a certain amount of time. And the problem was with email, people were getting flooded with like Jira notifications and corporate notifications, and they were finding it very hard to see through the mess to the stuff they had to actually deal with. Now, Slack can be incredibly busy again. If you're in all the channels with all the different things, it can be quite hard to do those things. So it might be that someone needs to be tagged explicitly in that meeting. Therefore, they're more likely to actually respond to those things. I've not had too many troubles. I've had it once or twice when maybe I felt a bit blocked. But where I am at the moment, at least, if I've messaged someone and they're online, there is sort of an implied they'll get back to me. And unless it's really important, that's okay. But yeah, we've not specified it. I don't really think having an SLA kind of term for communications is really like not across the board. That can't work.
I agree. I think an SLA is ridiculous because we're all busy and we all have priorities that we need to cope with. Even if we're online, we might be busy on something else and we don't want to be disturbed. I would say again, we should communicate by saying this is urgent or relative. If you say in the message that you want someone to get back to you as quickly as possible, then put that in the message. My expectation is if it's not particularly urgent, I would perhaps chase the next day, give them time to actually have work today. They might be in training. They might be busy in client meetings. They might be working on project work. So give them the opportunity to actually do it and then chase probably the next day is my personal preference, especially for a general email or a Teams message. I wouldn't expect people to come back within half an hour. Just because they're green doesn't mean to say that they're available.
As sort of leaders, how do you approach when you may have an engineer or a person who's just not buying into that asynchronous communication at all? You just can't get the communication that you need. What sort of tactics do you guys sort of use there to approach that, to improve that? Or do you have a set methodology or strategy around there? Because sometimes people just don't work particularly well in that way, do they?
I know a guy that was really against asynchronous work because he saw people taking it outside of the normal working hours, and he was then being excluded from important architectural decisions and things, and he had a real problem. And if I didn't know that context when we were trying to talk about how we communicate asynchronously, I wouldn't necessarily have understood, and I might well have trod on his feet in it and made things worse behind those things. I don't think there's a set way you can do it. Like we've said, I think some people have flow and ways of working. And I think, was it Simon did a blog a while back on a communications README where people would actually write like, this is the best way to reach me at these sorts of times. I will get back to you within those things. So it almost like a collaborative exercise where people could declare the best way for them to communicate, which is an interesting activity. I don't think it necessarily will always work, but I quite like communicating with people about how best to communicate with people.
I think it's an important thing. I think that probably as a manager, we should know our group and be able to communicate with them. And one thing I've always done with management is to make sure that I try and make myself as available for my group as much as possible. I also talk to them all the time and try and do a face-to-face meeting as much as I can, if necessary, rather than trying to do written communication, so that then they get used to talking face-to-face or as much face-to-face as possible. So therefore, I'm not just the face when it's bad news, because I've had managers before where they only came to my desk when it was bad news, and other than that, they were just in their office. And I just completely disagree with that. I think that a manager should be seen whenever and should be able to communicate. And also what I try and do is try and not just deliberately call them in Teams. I actually ask permission or ask them if they are free, rather than just expecting them always to be there. So therefore, I'm giving them a bit of respect, because actually they are in charge of their time. I'm just their line manager. And so therefore, I'm supporting their work, not dictating to them when they should be available.
Yeah, I think that's really important as a leader to be considerate like that, because again, it's the context of that person. You don't know where their headspace is, if they're concentrating, whatever. So yeah, asking if they're available is really, really important. I think, Steve, to my thought around what you were asking is also speak to them and say, hey, look, I'm not getting what I need from you here. Is there a problem, or is there some better way I can do this? This is my expectation as a leader. You may not know that, but this is my expectation. Are you able to fulfill that expectation? And if so, how? And then it's having that open and honest conversation. It's about feedback loops. It's, as a leader, we've got to be able to take feedback. So that person may go, look, I just don't like it. You communicate in this way. It's so short and snappy. Okay, let's take an example. How can I have made that better for you to receive, more comfortable to receive? It means we have to juggle sort of all these things. If you're leading like 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 people, you're like, okay, this person likes it this way, this person likes it this way. But that's our job, right? We are an enabler of teams. That's what a leader is. And so the onus is on us to make sure that we are asking those questions and finding out about who we report to us and how they can be effectively communicated to.
Yeah, I'd agree completely there. Being able to adapt your style to the audience is ultra important. And almost on the flip side of something that I really miss about natural holistic communication, when the pandemic really started, we almost went completely hybrid overnight. We had the opportunity to work from home, but it really was sort of one day a week if you wanted to. But now it's sort of inverted, if you like. And I'm a big believer that if you surround yourself with people, you become who you're surrounded with. And when we're working with a really integrated, knitted, high impactful team, the communication that we had in between the communication was the most valuable part. The conversation around, have you seen this in React? Or have you seen this in Bitbucket? Have you seen this? And losing that little bit of communication through asynchronous sort of existence and working, I think has been one of my biggest misses around about communication. We've tried to introduce things like Discord, or we may have introduced sort of open Slack channels or huddles, where it's very much an open community. People can just join it at all times. Some of the teams, they just sit in there all day and they don't necessarily say anything all day, but the channel is open to try and to improve that natural boiler chat, that water boiler chat. And so I wondered if we're using tools to try and help with that. Do you guys do similar things as well to try and capture that really important information?
Not really at work. I mean, we've had the tester hangout that Chris and I are on quite often, and we're on all the time. And I found that really useful in exactly the same way as you described there, Steve. With it's like having someone sitting beside you. It's like you're in an office environment, and that was great. Having somebody to chat to or go, I don't really get that. All of that organic communication. I've seen it tried in a couple of organizations where the teams are quite large, and it didn't really work because everybody would just join the channel, switch off their thing, and go mute. Yeah. So yeah. It doesn't work in that way, so it can be a bit artificial, but I think it's a good idea if it works within a team.
Brilliant. And thank you very much for communicating, Chris, Shey and Steve today. So thank you all for listening to this. We Can Communicate, continuing with the podcast forever and a day. Please do come back and listen to us again. Please communicate also with us. You can either email us at contact@testingpeers.com or through the normal communication channels of LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or you can support us on patreon.com. And all those places, please look for us and Testing Peers. So thanks again to Shey and Steve for standing in for our usual members. I hope you enjoyed our talk on communication. I'd like to thank our sponsors again, Saffron QA, and please join us again next time for another conversation.
For now, it's goodbye from the Testing Peers.
Goodbye.